Donald, welcome to the Forge. I'm thrilled to have you join us today. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation today.
Good, me too. Where are you calling in from, Donald?
I'm in Windsor, in Ontario, so just across the river from Detroit.
Okay, okay, and that is your place of residence, if I'm correct, if I know it right.
Kind of temporarily. I'm actually going to Scotland in a week's time, and then I'm probably going to Greece. I kind of live part time in Greece, move between Canada and Greece.
Where's your favorite place to live? That's a tricky question,
Oh
huh?
gosh, now I'm going to get into trouble. Like, Um, my favorite, to be honest, my favorite place to live is Athens. Um, so I'm always kind of keen to go there. Um, I've been traveling there a lot over the past 3 or 4 years, and I have permanent residence status now in Greece,
Wow.
and I've got a non-profit that I've set up in Greece as well. So like, in the future, I'm probably going to be spending a lot more time in Greece.
And that's got to be fascinating. I've never been there, but it's on my list. And somebody like you that studies, ancient philosophy, that's got to be. I mean, you're at the heart of it, right? You're at the seat of a lot of the stuff that you study was happening right there. So I can only
Yeah.
imagine that's a pretty interesting experience.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Like if you're into something, there's a lot of people, a lot of classicists never go to Athens, weirdly. One of my friends was writing about this recently, actually, and for a long time I kind of didn't think it was necessary for me to go there, and then I went, and I guess I fell in love with the place, and so yeah, I do get a lot of inspiration from being able to go there and walk. I'm doing work at the moment in Plato's Academy, Academia Platonos, which is a park where Plato's Academy used to be located, and Plato was buried there. Like no one ever tells you that. Like,
Wow.
but when you're walking in the park, I like to imagine that Plato was walking right. We're walking in his footsteps, and he was talking about philosophy. And Socrates was walking there at one point. And as we walk in the park, we're walking on the ground where Plato's bones are probably, where his remains are still under the ground there somewhere, probably. So that it does give you a kind of feeling of being more connected. I don't think you have to do that to be able to appreciate philosophy, but it brings it a bit more to life.
Yeah, I would love to go there and maybe do, just study while you were there. I think that would be
Mm-hmm.
a great kind of connection. So, I mean, really, that's, I did the intro before we started here about your background, but, a lot of it is in Stoic philosophy, but also what I love about you is you take a little bit different approach, maybe not a different approach, but you bring something else to the table. And that
Mm-hmm.
is, modern psychotherapy and more specifically, cognitive behavioral therapy. And anybody that's watching on YouTube, I'm going to hold up one of Don's books, The Philosophy of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. And I teach at the University of Colorado, and I want to build a course around this. I would love to
Mm-hmm.
take this as my textbook and create a course around leadership and the philosophy of leadership with obviously a strong slant toward Stoic philosophy. So, tell us a little bit about cognitive behavioral therapy, Don. Let's start there because I think some of the listeners are going to not really be sure what that is.
Let's start with what the word means, like with real basics. So cognitive means to do with thinking, basically, it means thoughts and beliefs, broadly speaking. And we call it cognitive behavioral therapy because it deals with your voluntary thoughts and actions as a way of changing your emotions. So cognitive behavioral therapy is a therapy that aims at changing emotions by changing what we have leverage over, the way we think and the way that we behave. And cognitive, the reason, I guess, to cut to the chase as well, um, the reason that that book is about CBT and Stoicism is that cognitive therapy kind of evolved in the mid 1950s originally, and then it didn't really become really mainstream until about the 1980s, mid late 1980s. And the pioneers of cognitive therapy were inspired by Stoic philosophy. Like that's where they got the idea from. It's actually an interesting story. Albert Ellis is a New York psychotherapist. And like a lot of people in the 50s, he was kind of mainly psychoanalytic, psychodynamic, sort of broadly influenced by Freud's followers. But he became disillusioned with it. And he decided it just wasn't really working out for him. And Ellis did something that I always admire. He kind of tore everything up and decided to start again completely from scratch. So he thought there's no use trying to kind of like fix this model. I need to just start from scratch. What would be a more sensible way of doing psychotherapy? And he remembered reading Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus when he was a teenager. He'd read the Stoics. And so he kind of developed an approach which was originally called rational emotive therapy or rational therapy. We now call it rational emotive behavior therapy, or REBT. And it was the first form of what we now call CBT, or the main precursor of CBT. And it's based on what we call the cognitive model of emotion. Let's get right to the very core of what CBT is. So the way I like to explain this is if a client comes into therapy, every client that comes into therapy sits down in the chair in the consulting room, and then they'll tell you what's wrong with them, right? Presenting problem. So they'll be anxious or depressed usually, maybe have some anger, maybe some problems with habits. And then they'll go on and talk about the impact that has on them. So it's destroying their relationships, affecting their sleep, it's giving them stomach ulcers or affecting their health. It's making it difficult for them to study or to perform well at work. It's been going on for years. They've tried everything and nothing works. And so, after having explained all this stuff, which is really useful information for the psychotherapist doing their assessment, there's something else that's going on. Like the client has given them a long list of motivation for change. They've listed all the reasons why they should probably do something to get out of this hole that they're in. This is all terrible stuff. It sounds awful. And my depression is just destroying my relationships. It's damaged my health. I can't go on like this anymore. But then usually the client reaches a point, having given this big list of reasons, where they express what we call stuckness. So they say, I know this is awful, and I know that I really desperately need to change it, but I can't help it. It's just the way that I feel. And that's an expression of stuckness. And Ellis used to lean forward at that point and smile and say, yes, but it's not just how you feel, is it? It's also how you think. And that, my friend, is the beating heart of cognitive therapy. It's the cognitive model of emotion, the research-based model, that holds that emotions aren't separate from thoughts, but emotions are based upon thoughts to a large extent. And that when our thoughts change, our emotions typically change, albeit sometimes after a delay, and there might be other factors, but broadly speaking. And so our thoughts give us leverage to some extent, to a large extent, over our emotions. And once we realize that, and the thing is that most people don't realize this, the majority of people assume that their emotions are quite separate from their thoughts. They don't realize how closely connected they are. Once we do realize that, it opens a toolbox, opens a magical toolbox, which we sometimes call the armamentarium of cognitive therapy techniques. Because unlike feelings as normally understood, thoughts have propositional content. And by that, I mean they're true or false. And that means that we can examine the evidence for them. It means that we can question contradictions or logical fallacies in them. It means we can look at how true or rational or evidence-based or helpful or unhelpful certain styles of thinking are, what alternative ways of thinking might be. So there's many, many angles that we can now adopt to change the thinking and thereby to change our emotions. And the Stoics knew this. This is the cornerstone of Stoicism in a way, or certainly of Stoic psychology and psychotherapy. And so Ellis, this is a research-based model. And the research is nuanced and complicated and technical. And Ellis thought, how can I explain this to clients? Every psychotherapist is also, in a sense, a translator. We have to study quite jargon-laden, surprisingly technical research studies if we want to stay up to date. But then we have to sit down in front of like a 15-year-old kid, or an elderly lady, or a bus driver, or a bricklayer, or the CEO of a big company, or whoever, and explain what's going on based on this complicated research using complex statistics and stuff. But we have to explain it in plain English. And the way that Ellis did that was he just taught most of his clients all of his clients and all of his students a quote from Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher. And I would say it's the most famous quote from Stoicism. And it's from the Enchiridion, or Handbook of Epictetus. It's passage number 5. And it says, it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. And that, in a nutshell, is the cognitive, it's a simplified version of the cognitive model of emotion. And once someone really understands that, and it takes a bit of work to properly assimilate that viewpoint, then they've opened the door to change. And that's when cognitive therapy can really start working.
Whoa, and this is a lot of what you said. That's why I'm excited about this. It's something that is, I don't know, for me personally, I can just I can see it and I can understand it, and it's not complicated. Let me go back to a couple things you said, Donald. So are you telling me that my thoughts are not true?
Well, probably most of our thoughts aren't true, right? But especially if we get them from YouTube and the TV and newspapers and whatnot. So yeah, it's funny actually. It's more humbling if you look at history. Like if you think about a lot of the things that people believed, 100 years ago, or 200 or 300. In retrospect, it's easy to go, those guys believe some crazy stuff. Like, well, people are going to look at us 100 years from now. I hate to break it to you, gentle, listener or viewer, but people are going to look back at our society and think we believed a lot of crazy, and not just false things, but logically contradictory, like absurd, like incoherent things that we somehow managed to believe. People often believe things that
Yeah.
aren't even compatible, beliefs that aren't even compatible with one another. So yeah, we believe a lot of stuff that's not true. I'll give you an example with regard to anxiety. So my specialism is in treating anxiety. And so we could dig a little bit deeper and we could say, look, different emotions have a different cognitive structure. So anxiety, this is a broad generalization. It doesn't cover necessarily every instance, but broadly speaking, we could say that anxiety is a belief that something catastrophic is about to happen and that I won't be able to cope with it. And that's it used to be called the transactional model of stress that's based on. That's Beck's, R&T Beck is the other pioneer of cognitive therapy. That's basically the simplified version of his cognitive model of anxiety. The Stoics said almost exactly the same thing 2,300 years ago. Like, if they said, well, what sort of thoughts cause what sort of emotions then? Well, those are the kind of thoughts, very simply. It's kind of common sense model in a way. Now, an example of that would be people with panic disorder, which is a type of anxiety disorder where you essentially have a very acute, very intense feeling of anxiety that peaks very rapidly and feels overwhelming. And it's a specific type of anxiety. Now, Freud and other psychoanalytic therapists used to think that panic disorder was virtually untreatable. They didn't have much success dealing with it. And in the mid-1980s, a cognitive therapist called David Clark developed a treatment protocol for an evidence-based, research-based treatment protocol that took the treatment from zero to hero. It went from people thinking it was untreatable to thinking actually it's one of the most treatable types of anxiety. And a big part of it, it's not the only part, it's complex treatment, but a big part of it is that many people, not all people, but many people who have panic attacks believe that something catastrophic is about to happen very imminently. In many cases, they believe they're going to have a stroke or a heart attack. So people often confuse the physical sensations of panic with the sensations that they think they would have if they're having a heart attack. And that's why many people having panic attacks call an ambulance. So they go into accident and emergency because they think they're dying. And of course, if you think you're having a heart attack, if you think you're about to die, you're probably going to freak out. Like, it's pretty scary, and that's going to cause your anxiety to mount, and then that's going to cause the feelings of tightness, your heart beating rapidly to increase. So it becomes a kind of vicious cycle or a spiral, and that's partly why it peaks so quickly and feels so overwhelming. It's almost anxiety about anxiety. It's fear of the physical sensations of anxiety. Now that's going to create a feedback loop, and you're going to fry your brain pretty quickly, like if that's how you think about it. But if you could prove to someone that actually you're not having a heart attack, and all you're feeling is like the tightness of the muscles in your chest. Your heart's just beating fast because you're scared, but there's nothing else really going on that's particularly dangerous. And if they really believed that, then it would reduce their anxiety. It might not remove it completely, but obviously that's going to be very different now than the guy who believes that he's actually about to drop dead in a minute, like unless he can somehow stop his heart beating so fast. So that's a pretty clear example of a situation where believing that something catastrophic is about to happen and there's nothing you can do to cope with it is a recipe for anxiety, and that correcting that false belief, it's basically a misconception. It's just a straight up factually wrong belief. That correcting that misconception would help a lot, and might, along with other techniques, cure the anxiety disorder.
I know this is a tough, I've suffered from anxiety a fair amount in my life. And, I've heard some people call it fear about fear, which I kind of like. But I struggle with what's the difference. And if this is a tough, I think this is a tough question. What's the difference between fear and anxiety? How would you describe the difference between fear and anxiety?
Well, first of all, I'd say I don't think there's a definitive answer to that, because I think different people maybe use those words in slightly different ways. However, funnily enough, in cognitive therapy, Aaron Beck addresses precisely that question in a book that he wrote called The Cognitive Therapy and the Emotional Disorders, which was published in late 1960s, I think he published that book. And he answers precisely that question. It's one of the first books on cognitive therapy. So Beck says, and this is semantics, like I say, people might use the words in different ways, that fear, the way that most people use that word, implies cognition more. And people usually use anxiety to refer more to the affective side of it. Like people are usually referring more to the sensations, the feelings, when they talk about anxiety, and they're usually talking more about what they're afraid of, like, or what they're afraid might happen. Like, they're focusing usually a bit more on the content and the thinking when they use the word fear. But fear and anxiety are very closely intertwined. Now, I would say, I guess if people are really sharp and we wanted to dig into this, we'd say, look, the cognitive model is a bit of an oversimplification, because there are certainly situations where you can have feelings of anxiety, arguably, where you're not really thinking that something bad is going to happen. And now, once you dig that deep, though, you really get into areas where people might disagree about the terminology. So maybe it becomes a little bit academic. But an easy example would be if someone ran up behind you and yelled boo, then you'd have what we technically refer to as the startle reflex response. So you'd jump out your skin, and your heart rate would shoot up, and your pupils would dilate, and your muscles would become tense, and your blood pressure would go up, and all that kind of good stuff, just because someone ran up behind you and popped a balloon or something, or yelled boo when you weren't expecting it. And that doesn't seem to be anything to do with any beliefs that you have, because it completely caught you by surprise, right? So that's just a reflex response. That arguably is completely mechanical. It's completely physiological. And but then the question would be, do you call that anxiety or not? Or is it a kind of precursor of anxiety? Some people might not. But what really matters is that the startle reflex will normally go away pretty quickly. It's not normally a big problem, right? It becomes more of a problem if you then start to worry about it and you impose cognitions on top of it. So Seneca even mentions this. He says, Seneca says, animals that are frightened by a predator, and in this passage in his letters, the Stoic philosopher Seneca, if you redacted his name and asked someone to read it, I think they quite feasibly would think it came from a modern book on stress or something like that. So Seneca says wild animals like deer, if they're startled by a predator, freak out, they're alarmed, their heart rate shoots up, as we would say today, and they bolt. But then once the threat has gone, before long they calm down and they return to grazing. But humans don't. We keep freaking out. Weeks, months later, we'll still be ruminating about that time that we saw that tiger. And then we'll be thinking, what if I saw a tiger? and worrying about hypothetical problems. So Seneca says our ability to think about the past and about the future is our greatest asset, but also our greatest burden. And it causes us to freak out about things that don't exist anymore or don't exist yet in a way that animals don't experience. And that's true. So this physiological element of anxiety arguably isn't that much of a problem. It's natural, it's healthy, it kind of comes and goes, but it becomes a problem when we keep triggering it inappropriately, or when we keep maintaining it at a kind of in a chronic way.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds like chronic stress, right? I mean, certainly anxiety would fall under, I believe, it would fall under the kind of the umbrella of
Yeah.
probably distress, and that is not going to be good. So what I'm hearing is this is all about how we think. It's about our interpretation of the things that are happening to us. Would you say that anxiety lives in the future? I don't know if that's maybe that is a little simplistic. Because we can time travel with our mind, we have something called imagination. Is that where our anxiety usually lives?
Yeah, basically. And again, it's a bit broad. It's a little bit of a simplification, but broadly speaking, anxiety tends to be future focused. It's one of the main characteristics of it. And even the Stoics talk about this. They know this, but the cognitive therapists will often talk about the fact one of the variables is called looming vulnerability. That's a technical term, research construct. So looming vulnerability is kind of like how imminent and rapidly approaching we think a threat is. So if I think, something bad's going to happen, but it's not going to happen for ages, and I'll give plenty of time to prepare for it, then that tends not to be as anxiety provoking. But if I think, oh my God, it's going to happen right now, then I'll tend to, my anxiety will escalate more quickly. If someone's got a spider phobia and they see a spider moving really slowly, really far away, it'll make them less anxious than if they see a spider shooting up their trouser leg really quickly. So the speed of approach of a threat is another kind of variable, and that has to do with the future, how much time is involved. So there are a number of ways we can analyze anxiety, but typically it's future focused. And like I say, I mean, I think an important part of it, people don't ask about this that much, but I kind of hinted at it a moment ago, is that in addition to the time element and the future focus, there's the appraisal of threat, which is that something really bad is very likely to happen. So if I think there's something going to happen, but it's not that bad, I'm probably not going to feel that anxious. Or if I think it's pretty bad, but it's really unlikely to happen, then I might not feel anxious. So I'm going to think that it's likely to happen and it's really bad. So high probability, high severity. But also, I have to have a low appraisal of my coping. That seems to be quite fundamental to anxiety. So if I think, man, something really bad is really likely to happen really soon, but I'm a really tough guy and I can handle anything, then I'm probably not going to feel anxious, right? Equally, if I think, geez, man, I'm a hopeless mess and I can't cope with anything, but this thing that's about to happen isn't that dangerous anyway, then I might not feel anxious. But if I really want to feel anxious, I'll think something really bad is really likely to happen and I've got no idea how to cope with it. Then I'm going to freak out.
Well, I think you just hit on what this podcast is all about, right? I think you've been involved with some discussions around mental toughness. I know you've written a book on resilience, and this idea that if we can build up those coping mechanisms, we can deal with these things that are thrown at us a little bit better in life. And I think that's at the heart of at least what I would like to see more people do. So that's good stuff right there. I think that's going to get clipped out of there as a highlight. So, here's the thing, Don, I'm fascinated. Again, this book that you wrote. So we're talking about modern psychotherapy, much of what we're saying so far. And as you said, it was really kind of based on these people, these old philosophers, I don't know, I think you said 2,300 years ago. And what's fascinating to me is 2,300 years ago, we have these gentlemen, I think they were for the most part gentlemen, and they were coming up with these ideas that we now see through good, solid, robust research that they were pretty darn, I mean, they kind of hit the nail on the head pretty well. So I would ask you, I'm fascinated by this. Why do you think they were so good at, I'll just call it psychology. They were good at human psychology, but they didn't have all of the modern science that we have nowadays, but they got it right. How do you think they did that?
I'm going to give I've thought about that a lot, and it's a tricky question in some ways, but there's several answers to it. So one of them is, in all honesty, like you have to remember, this is before television, right? I'm being a bit glib, but these guys had more time on their hands to think about things. And so what you tend to find with ancient thinkers is that they go deeper into more fundamental questions. And it's actually quite surprising that today we talk a lot and say very little compared to guys like Socrates. Like they talked less and said more. Like they had more time on their hands to contemplate the big questions in life more deeply. We're all over the place, like talking about all sorts of trivial stuff most of the time. And Socrates, this sounds like an odd thing to say, a very simple thing to say. Like if I'm kind of used to talking, simplifying philosophy for people, and I learned a lot by teaching my little girl about philosophy. I have a daughter who's 10 years old now, but I've been teaching her about philosophy since she was 5. And I thought, what's the simplest thing that Socrates says? One of the simplest things that Socrates says is, and this is the way you might explain it to a child, that we should talk more about what the word wisdom means. Like Socrates thinks it's really important to discuss how we would define wisdom, and also how we would define other ideas like knowledge and justice. Like these are big questions. He's quite candid about it. Says these are the most important things in life, and the meaning of life is to try and understand these things. Well, very simply, today, I don't think you really hear people even use that word much, or use the concept much, or talk about it. Socrates would look at us and think, those guys aren't talking about wisdom at all. They're talking about everything except wisdom. So why are they forgetting what, in his eyes, was the most important question in life? So they go deeper into more basic questions. Now, the real puzzle about this is, what are we doing? Like how did we end up all over the place? How did we end up so easily distracted from the things which on reflection seem obviously really important? So another way of looking at it would be, they talk a lot about death and what it means to come to terms with our own death in a similar way. People don't really talk about that much these days. Ancient philosophers write about that very extensively. They talk about it a lot. Today, the internet is awash with self-help, self-improvement, like fluff. But a lot of it doesn't address these really basic questions. It kind of skirts around them in ways that ancient philosophy really doesn't. Ancient philosophy goes straight for the jugular and says, have you guys ever thought about the fact that you could drop dead tomorrow? And what does that really mean? They ask those questions. It's refreshing. Now, I would say with psychotherapy, with that in mind, I can't explain exactly why this happened, but something weird happened with Freud. And in all honesty, I studied Freud pretty extensively when I was a young guy. I have a master's degree in psychoanalytic theory, by the way. But and my honest take on this is that cognitive psychotherapy already existed to some extent in the late 19th century. There was a guy called Paul Dubois, who's a Swiss psychiatrist, that founded a precursor of modern cognitive therapy. And it was fairly widespread. It was called rational persuasion psychotherapy. And it was they based it on Seneca's writings to some extent. Now, it was eclipsed by Freudian psychoanalysis for over half a century. Why did that happen? Because in retrospect, Freud never did a shred of research. It's all armchair psychology. He literally made it all up off the top of his head, right? And very little of it, some people get upset when I say this, but very little of what Freud said is of much value today, in my eyes anyway. I happily debate that, people that disagree. So what happened? How did Freud manage to convince us that anxiety is the repressed castration anxiety, for example? How did he manage to persuade us, rather than taking a much more down-to-earth physiology, cognitive-based approach to to these problems. I think in part it was because he talked a lot about sex. If we look at the kind of cultural history of psychoanalysis, I think it's pretty clear that Freud became a celebrity because he wrote and gave talks about sexual perversion. And at the time, that was considered sensational, right? So a lot of people knew about Freud, not because they were particularly interested in his theories and stuff, but because they knew that he was talking about fetishism, about homosexuality, about things that were kind of taboo in Victorian society to talk about. And it legitimized conversation. And that was a good thing in a way. But it led to a kind of celebrity or popularity about Freudian theory that caused it to eclipse, I would say, more rational, common sense, down to earth, and ultimately evidence-based approaches to psychotherapy. So sensational stuff caught people's attention and kind of like a shiny object. Like it sort of distracted people from much more basic. Sometimes the truth is a bit dull, right? Like you think, geez, is that all the what? Like when you show someone how the magic trick was done, why did you get the rabbit out of the hat? Oh, well, it's pretty, once you explain it, it's kind of boring. So when you explain to people how anxiety works and stuff, they go, really? It's kind of banal in a way. It's not like repressed castration anxiety and the Oedipus complex and all this kind of weird stuff. No, it's not. But that sometimes a false explanation is more tantalizing. It's sexier, than a boring, accurate. And we fell for that as a culture. Like we fell for this kind of, it's a kind of sophistry in a way. Freud led us down the garden path with the Oedipus complex. So you have panic attacks. That's because you want to sleep with your mum and you're frightened to admit it. And that's, now that seems ludicrous. And he had zero success treating panic attacks, right? But that seems completely ludicrous now. That we can cure panic attacks with 90% reliability. It doesn't have anything to do with that. But he wrote so many books, and so many books and articles were written about it because it sounded really interesting. People thought that's interesting. And Victorians seemed to be in the market for stories about incest and kind of fetishism and sexual stuff. Funny? And then it ended up being a complete wild goose chase, as it were, I would say.
Yeah, well, gosh.
Apart from in Russia, where they thought Freud was a fruitcake and they wouldn't touch his theories with a barge pole. And so in Russia, they continued to use rational persuasion psychotherapy. And to a large extent, when cognitive and behavioral therapy emerged in America, it was partly because American psychologists were reading Russian literature on mental health.
I did not know that. Going back to where this started, I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated by that they got so much right a long time ago, and I agree with you 100%. I think they just spent more time deep in thought. They reflected on things. They weren't as busy, right? And we are a society that's distracted and overscheduled and frazzled, and we don't ever want to be bored.
Those
right?
cat memes won't watch themselves. Do you know how many episodes? Do you know how many episodes of Friends there are? And Star Trek. Someone's got to watch all that stuff.
Apparently.
So that's what we do. And they would look at us and laugh. Of course. If Socrates could see modern society, he'd think that we were just like those characters in Plato's cave. In Plato's allegory of the cave, the idea is that these people are kind of chained in a cave and they see a shadow play on the wall in front of them, but they never see the real world outside. And it's just like us being glued to YouTube.
Wow.
He would look at that and he would think, wow, it happened. You guys are all glued to computer screens.
We're watching,
and listening to.
We're watching the shadows on the wall. That's a great analogy. Yeah, it's disturbing to me. You know, a lot. I think I've heard that philosophy, certainly in that time, was really this idea of being a seeker of wisdom. To be a philosopher
Mm.
was that, and so I feel like we've lost a lot of that in our modern society, and I don't know that that is serving us well. So if you're listening, maybe spend a little more time in deep thought and ponder those big questions in life, and maybe we can figure out some things. Let's shift gears here a little bit, Don. I think this is your newest book. You're so busy, it's hard to keep track. But How to Think Like a Roman Emperor: The Stoic
Mm.
Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. I read this a little while back, and there was one part of it that really stuck out to me, and it was a Hesiod poem.
Mm.
If I'm saying that right, I hope I'm saying that right.
Mm.
And let me read this, and hopefully I won't butcher it. So for the listeners that maybe haven't read the book, I doubt that you've come across this poem. So this is probably new to you. So let me read this. Wickedness can be had in abundance easily. Smooth is the road, and very nigh she dwells. But in front of virtue, the gods immortal have put sweat. Long and steep is the path to her, and rough at first. But when you reach the top, then at length the road is easy, hard though it was. What is the
Mm.
wisdom in these words? What's your interpretation of this, Don?
I'm going to repeat another quote back to you, which I think is related, and it's one of my favorite quotes actually. It comes from Spinoza's Ethics, and I'm not even going to explain it actually. I'll just kind of leave it sitting with people, and they can go and have a think about it themselves because it's sort of quote you can show over. Spinoza said, "It's one of my I think it's a beautiful quote." He said, "All excellent things are as difficult as they are rare. All excellent things are as difficult as they are rare." That's one of my favorite quotations. It's kind of related. It's not exactly the same. It's kind of related to what Hesiod is saying here. Um, this is quoted by Socrates in Xenophon's book, Memorabilia Socratis, not in Plato, actually, but in another another set of dialogues that we have by another author about Socrates. And Socrates is giving a speech that was actually written by a sophist called Prodicus that he was kind of friends with. And Socrates kind of put his own spin on that speech. We call that speech the Choice of Hercules today. That's the name that we give it. And it's basically a type of speech that was called in the ancient world protreptic, or an exhortation, we call it, to philosophy or a life of virtue. It's meant to motivate people to, it's a wake up call, as we would say today. That's what an exhortation is. It's a speech that people would give that's meant to it's mainly aimed at young men, and it was meant to kind of shake them up. It's sort of motivational, inspirational talk. And Socrates kind of prefaces it with this quote from Hesiod, which basically says, look, there's something weird about human nature, in that something about the way that our brain is wired predisposes us to look for the easy option in life. Of course, nobody wants trouble. Everybody always wants to kind of like take the shortcut, like the easy path in life. Um, but if you want to really flourish, if you want resilience, if you want wisdom, sometimes you have to voluntarily go down the road less traveled, as it were. Sometimes you have to voluntarily embrace hardship. Like, a good example would be, it's easier just to lie in bed all day and watch TV and eat Cheetos or whatever, right? But if you wanted to be fit and healthy, you kind of have to go outside and walk up and down hills or go to the gym or play sports or something like that. And that requires sweat, it requires effort, it requires discipline, endurance, and dedication. But ultimately, it's better for us. And the same is true of our intellectual life. It's easy just to sit and watch YouTube videos, and kind of passively soak up, the modern equivalent of Sigmund Freud, like sophistry and garbage and just random flim flam and nonsense off the internet, like this ocean of self help that doesn't actually help anybody. It's easy just to kind of sit like a big sponge and just passively soak that up. But here's the rub: if you want self improvement, you have to actually do stuff. It's an activity. You've got to kind of like get off your backside, and sometimes if you really want to change, you have to challenge yourself. You're going to have to dispute some of your own beliefs. You're going to have to be tough on yourself sometimes. You're going to have to change your mind about stuff. like shock horror. You're going to have to admit that you were wrong about certain things if you ever want to kind of get out your comfort zone and grow as an individual. And so Hesiod is saying, if you follow the easy path, you'll never really flourish. Like you won't grow. And in fact, if anything, you'll just be moving backwards. Like this is a path of decay. Like, but although it goes against our instincts in some ways to do things that are painful or tiring, emotionally or physically, it's obvious in a sense. It's easy to look at other people and think that guy needs to get off his backside. It's harder when we look at ourselves and think, geez, maybe I need to get off my backside and go out there and do challenging things, like, and admit that I'm wrong sometimes if I want to become a stronger, healthier, and happier person. Maybe that's what life is actually all about. Like, maybe if you sit on your backside and do nothing, like, and just kind of eat Cheetos and watch, like the modern equivalent of Freud on the internet, like, which, I won't name any names apart from, obviously Jordan Peterson is a good example, but like, Joe Rogan.
You
and
mentioned
stuff like
a name.
that. Like, but if you're just kind of like soaking up all that garbage off the internet, then, your brain will rot and you have to think for yourself. Like, if you want to flourish as a human being and grow, that's what Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. Right? It's a wake-up call that he was trying to give us to say you have to think critically, and you have to learn to see through some of the strategies that we are subject to brainwashing day in, day out. I thought the sophists were all dead, the 4th century, 5th century BC quasi philosophers that Socrates talks about. These guys that used rhetoric they were orators that tried to manipulate audiences. I thought they were all dead, and then I realized, Facebook is a sophist, YouTube is a sophist, Twitter is a sophist. What we get from these social media is a great, great thing, but we pay a heavy price for it. And that clearly people end up, first of all, in a bubble where they just see more and more stuff that's fed to them that agrees with their existing viewpoints. I learned this when I looked at my friends' YouTube accounts, borrowed their YouTube account, and saw all the stuff that was in their feed. So it's all either kind of crazy left-wing political stuff or crazy right-wing political, depending on what they're into, and that's all they see. It's like a weird feedback loop. It's really obvious. Go borrow someone who doesn't agree with your political views' YouTube account and look at the videos that they're seeing. It just gives them more of the same, right? It's crazy.
That would scare
me. An echo chamber. It's kind of shocking.
Yeah.
But what Hesiod is saying is that, sometimes we need to admit that we're wrong. We need to go out and face tough challenges in life. And that's the meaning of life. When you're lying on your deathbed and you look back on it, nobody's going to think, as the Grim Reaper hovers above you, geez, I wish I'd spent more time watching cat videos, or I wish I'd watched more episodes of Star Trek, or, just before your light snuffed out. When you look back in your life, all that stuff just kind of blurs into nothingness. What you remember is the fact that you grew, the fact that you overcame challenges. That's the stuff that life is actually made up of. And that's what Hesiod is encouraging his readers, his listeners to understand.
And that's why I love that poem. That's it right there. We'd like to use the phrase "do hard things" here on the podcast, and the one thing that stands out to me, I love all of what you said. I don't think there's anything I would disagree with, except for the Star Trek thing. I don't know if I agree with you there, Don, but
nice Star Trek.
I like Star Trek. But this idea, I mean, the last part of it, here's the thing. I talk about this and I coach people on again, being mentally tough and resilient. And sometimes I'll get pushback and say, wait a minute, Ron, I have 3 kids and I'm working from home and I'm doing everything I can just to keep my head above water. I don't want to do anything hard right now. I don't want to work on myself right now. And I get that. I have empathy for that. I think there are times in life when you just don't have the capacity for that. But I would also say the last line in Hesiod's poem, he says, but when you reach the top, then at length the road is easy, hard though it was. So I think this idea that if we do the work, our life actually, in a paradoxical way, will become easier because we've strengthened ourselves. We've strengthened that resilience and that mental toughness, so that when the
Yeah,
things come at us in life, they don't disrupt us as easy. I mean, that's the way I read that, and that's why I love it so much.
it's easier when you look at other people. I think it's obvious. And the Greek, again, this is such a major theme in Greek philosophy. It's because these guys didn't have television and they just sat around, and it seemed pretty darn obvious to them that most people are the authors of most of their own suffering. Like, that seemed like a truism to Greek philosophers. They thought, clearly, if you look around you, and they like to look at the Greek tragedies, right? The Greek tragedies are, as the name implies, pretty tragic. Like, but Socrates thought it was a bit of a joke because he said, like the characters in the Greek tragedies are mainly just screwing up their own lives. Like, so Oedipus goes crazy because he's found out he's accidentally. Let's pick on Oedipus. Like, he sleeps with his own mother without realizing, because he was abandoned as a child, so he doesn't know that it's his mother. And then he finds out and goes crazy. Like, but the Stoics said, but like he doesn't have to go crazy. I mean, the only reason that this ends up as a tragedy is because he freaks out about it, makes a big deal about it. I mean, someone else in another universe might have went, "Oh my god, that's shocking," but I had no idea what I was doing, so I'm not going to like tear my hair out over it. But it's Oedipus's reaction to it that's the tragedy. Like, and it's the same with most of the characters in the Greek tragedies. They're the authors of their drama queens. They're hysterical. They're the authors of their own downfall and their own tragedy usually. And that's often true of life in general. We make life much harder for ourselves in many cases than it needs to be. So in psychotherapy, clients will often say they don't have the time to do therapy techniques at home or whatever, right? But I'll say something like, how much time do you spend each day worrying about stuff? And they'll go, well, hours. Like, so surely you're spending far more time and energy harming yourself than it would take to stop harming yourself. And then actually some of the work that you need to do, funnily enough, is negative. Like, it just consists in stopping doing certain things. And that takes literally less than zero time. Like, just
Yeah.
stopping doing stuff, like, is often the first stage in cognitive therapy. But people will usually use "I don't have time" as one of the most it's almost like a reflex. I haven't got time, like, as a kind of excuse for doing stuff. And yet they spend a hell of a lot of time actively sabotaging themselves, hours every day, or distracting themselves from meaningful goals in life. So we just got to see through that. It's a confidence trick that we play on ourselves, to say that we don't have the time and energy. We'd have a lot more energy if we weren't worrying or ruminating about negative stuff. Like,
Yeah.
so I just think we've got to do a better job of selling that to people and getting them to realize it's ultimately in their interest. I want to actually just interject to go back to something we said earlier, because I think this is important. We talked about anxiety, and we talked about that passage in Hesiod. I think one of the, and I also talked about how a lot of psychotherapy is common sense, and I think people are kind of distracted from basic truths. Now, I'm almost tired of saying this, because this is a truth so basic that many psychotherapists actually do become a little bit jaded, kind of repeating it and doing it with their clients. But I think it's important, partly for that reason. We know a great deal about how anxiety works. And one of the biggest lies about anxiety is that people don't understand that the physical sensations of anxiety tend to abate naturally through repeated prolonged exposure to the thing that triggers them. So in other words, if you're frightened of cats and you go in a room that's full of cats, your heart rate will double within a few seconds. It'll shoot up. You'll have an acute anxiety response if you've got a cat phobia and you see a bunch of cats. What happens next, though, is interesting. So you'll have a strong urge to leave the room. Like in Hesiod's example, it would be easiest thing for you is just to turn around and walk out the door. And then you'll avoid the hard work. You'll avoid the discomfort and the anxiety. And so everyone's strongest reflex is avoidance. Avoidance is the number one. Did you know avoidance is the number one most popular coping strategy in the whole world?
I didn't know
In
that.
history. Like, avoidance is everyone's favorite coping strategy. It's the easiest. Now, and it takes a multitude of forms. But if you do the opposite and exhibit what's something called approach behavior, so you stay in the room with the cats, gradually your heart rate will come down. It's going to feel horrible, like for 5, 10, 15 minutes, or whatever. But gradually your anxiety will wear off. That's what normally happens. And if you do that every day for, 3 or 4 days or whatever, for long enough, it'll wear off permanently, because that's how anxiety works. Basically, that's how it works at a reflex level, a kind of physiological level. That's one of the most robustly established findings in the entire field of psychotherapy research. We've known it for over half a century, and it's taken for granted by most researchers today. It's called the emotional habituation response. So it's kind of a little bit of, not even theory, but it's just an empirical fact. But I wanted to explain that because I think it's one of the most basic and important things for most people to realize about anxiety, because we have such a strong urge. Now, what happens, one form of avoidance is by thinking about things in abstract ways. We also avoid confronting them. So someone who has a cat phobia might complain a lot and talk a lot to their friends about how they're scared of cats. And that becomes a way of avoiding just being in a room with cats until the anxiety wears off. Or they might kind of sit and theorize and speculate about it and try and understand how the anxiety originated. So overthinking things sometimes can become a way of intellectualizing, rationalizing, and avoiding confronting our fears. This is endemic today. We're all talking no action. Right, but if you want to overcome anxiety, the one thing we know absolutely for certain is that prolonged repeated exposure to the things that make you feel anxious, broadly speaking, is the most reliable way of dealing with it.
Yeah, and I'm familiar. I assume you are as well. Stress inoculation training. So this idea of stressing yourself until it becomes more, I don't know, comfortable. But I think what you're saying, it's even worse, right? Let's be clear about this. When you take, I love the fact that we're taking this right back to Hesiod's poem, but when you take the easy path, you have that anxiety about whatever it is that's bothering you. You take the easy path and you avoid it, then you're making it stronger, right? So
You
you're
maintain your
creating
anxiety.
these, yeah. So you're making this anxiety even stronger every time you walk away from it instead of facing it, and so
It doesn't get better, and in some cases, you'll actually make it worse by doing that.
yeah. This is fun stuff. I could continue going forever, but I want to be respectful of your time, and so let's start to wrap this up. And let me start with this, Don. It took me a little while to get you on the podcast. I know you're busy. You're out there doing a lot of things. I've seen you kind of bounce around doing some talks and whatnot on the internet. What do you have going on, and how can people work with you? What's exciting right now for you?
Well, we started recently a non-profit called the Plato's Academy Centre in Athens, in Greece, and our goal was and is to try and bring philosophy back to the original location of Plato's Academy by building an international conference centre there where people can attend events. So it's a pretty ambitious goal. But we've got a board of advisors with some top authors and academics on it. We're promoting a virtual conference at the moment. It's happening at the end of May. And we've got a plan of action together, and we've got a lot of influential stakeholders involved. So we're well underway now to working on this project. And people want to find out about that, the website is just platosacademy.org. And also, if they want to find any of my stuff, like courses and social media and all that, and books and things, they can find my website, which is donaldrobertson.name. And the books that I'm working on at the moment, I just finished a graphic novel about Marcus Aurelius called Verissimus that's coming out in June. And I'm just putting the finishing touches to a history, a biography of Marcus Aurelius for Yale University Press's Ancient Life series, which will come out maybe towards the end of this year, start of next year. So those are the kind of things that I've been working on at the moment. People could check out. But the Plato's Academy project, is the thing I'm interested in really promoting, because it's a philanthropic, non-profit project. You know, we just want to get people doing the Socratic method. We want to get them appreciating Greek philosophy and culture more. And also, you know, part of the project is to bring foreign revenue and investment from all around the world into this relatively deprived suburb or a neglected part of Athens, which, you know, we think would benefit a lot from a little bit of, you know, love and attention and being restored. So we're hoping that it's a win-win for everybody. Like, we can get people to learn about Greek philosophy and come there, and also the local community can benefit, because at the moment the only people that go there are local Greeks to walk their dogs, and you would think that Plato's Academy had disappeared from history, but the ruins of some of the buildings are still there. It's a 38-acre park in the middle of Athens that people can go and visit, and they can walk in the footsteps of Plato and Socrates.
Wow. Well, consider me a fan. I'm hoping that does get up and running, because that would be a great thing for me to go visit at some point in the future. Let's go to, and by the way, I'll have all of those, as always, all of those will be in the show notes, links that you can find all the stuff that Donald just talked about. So let's go to the last question, Don. I know this is always a tough one, but what is your greatest failure, and what did you learn from it?
Well, first thing, I'll answer that question a little bit of a tangent by saying I think there are two types of people in this world. And there are people that learn from experience and people that don't, it seems to me. I think once you hit 40, roughly speaking, like, if you've got any sense, you should sit down and review your life and think about how it's gone so far. And there are many things that you can learn from that. Like, you can ask yourself simple questions, like, of all the times that you lent money to people over the years, what percentage of them gave you it back, and things like that, right? Stuff like that. But there's a lot of things you can learn just from your own experience. You don't really learn that easily from books and from other people. Some people just don't reflect on their lives in that way. But one of the meta overarching things that I think you learn is that many of the things that seem like failures or setbacks in life, in retrospect, you'll often realize that actually they were opportunities, or they led on to opportunities in life. Some of the worst things that happened to you, looking back, are possibly some of the best things that happened to you from another perspective. And easy examples are, like, everyone thinks that when a relationship ends, when your girlfriend dumps you or your wife divorces you, like, that's a catastrophe, right? But then that had to happen for you to go on and meet the next person in your life. So very few people think that the breakup of the first relationship, looking back decades later, is catastrophic, although it might have seemed like it at the time. One thing has to end for another thing to begin. Often for many people, losing their job is the best thing that can happen to them. It doesn't seem like it at the time, but then maybe they go on to become self-employed, or they find a better job, or, you know, in many cases, your life will actually improve as a result of things that seem like setbacks at the time. So that's why I find it, in a sense, I find it difficult, because I look back and think many of these things that seemed like failures are actually turned out to be good for me. And I try and kind of be grateful for that and appreciate it. One of the things the book that you held up earlier, when I was a young guy, I studied philosophy at university, and I graduated top of my year. I did surprisingly well. I dropped out of school, and I was kind of on the rubbish tip. I didn't think my life was going anywhere, and I kind of stumbled into university. You know, again, I probably wouldn't have wound up at university doing philosophy if I hadn't dropped out of school. And I did really well at university. And then I applied to do my PhD, and I think everybody thought I was kind of shoo-in to be a philosophy lecturer or something like that. And my PhD proposal got turned down, which came as a big shock to me, because I did so well at university. And And I kept applying to do PhDs. My proposals kept getting turned down. And I think it was in part because I wanted to focus on psychotherapy and stoicism, and it was a bit of a niche area. So that was a big failure. Like it was, it seemed like a shock to me. I thought, like, you know, I was bound to go on and have a career in academia, and it failed. Um, but then because of that, I went off and I wrote the book that you held up earlier. Because I thought, well, you know, if I can't do a PhD thesis at a university, you know, maybe I can just write a book and submit it to a publisher. And then the next thing was that book was meant to be aimed at an audience of psychotherapists and academic philosophers, but they didn't read it. Like they weren't remotely interested. It seems like a setback. It seems like a failure. But the weird thing was it reached an audience of people as a kind of self-help book. And then it led on to me writing other books. How to Thank a Roman Emperor is translated into 18 languages now, and it sold hundreds of thousands of copies around the world. Like, so if it hadn't have been, in a way, because of my failure to reach an academic audience, you know, maybe I wouldn't have gone on to become a self-help author. Like, so I would say, like, you know, my biggest failure in life was not getting my PhD, but you know, it worked out probably for the best for me in the long run.